Depending on whether you're collecting qualitative or quantitative data, we have slightly different ways we describe the tables and slightly different ways we describe the graphs, or we think about the graphs. Let's start with qualitative data, categorical data. The first step when you have this data is probably to organize it into a table. And we often use what are called frequency tables to organize data into. A frequency table must have at least 2 columns, and those 2 columns will have the categories of the data that you're working with, because this is, again, categorical data. And then corresponding in the table, you'll have the frequency or the number of data values that would be in each of those categories. Now, frequency tables can also include a couple of other things, and we'll look at those as well. Frequency tables can contain the relative frequency of each category. When I talk about relative frequency, I'm referring to the fraction or the percent of the data that's in that category. And then the other thing the table might include that's very common is the cumulative frequency of each category. Cumulative frequency is when you sum the number of data points that are in that category and as well as all the previous categories. So it's kind of like a cumulative total or an ongoing total as you go down through the table. It's almost easier to see that in practice. So let's go ahead and work with a table. We'll start with English papers and grades for an English paper in a class, because I think we're all familiar with getting a letter grade in an English paper. So I've got some listed here. In fact, let me just count them out. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 grades here. From a particular English class. And as you look through them, they're not organized. They were probably just listed as the papers got graded. But we do have some A's, some B's, some C's, some D's, and some F's. And so I would want to, in my table, start by putting the grade or the category in. So I need to organize by grade, which would be the category. So I'd have A's, B's, C's, D's, and F's. The frequency would be how many of each of those we have. So for instance, we would count up all the A's. So I'm just going to highlight the A's here. I've got 1A, 2, 3, 4 A's altogether. So I have 4 A's. So that would be the frequency. Now, frequency, again, is just a general term. A better way to say this in the table instead of saying frequency is you would say number of grades. Let's actually describe what this frequency is about. Number of grades for that category. So number of grades would be a better way of saying that. So there are 4 A's. And then we could do the same thing for B's. I count up the B's, 1, 2, 3 B's. And I could do the same thing for C's. 1, 2, whoops, I skipped 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And D's. 1, 2. And there's only one grade left, which is an F. Now, it is important that you've actually counted up how many grades there are, because a good way to check when you are creating a frequency table is you want to make sure you didn't miss anything. So what we often have in a frequency table is the total number of grades. And don't just put a 17 there, add these up and make sure it's going to correspond with the 17 grades we knew we had. So 4 plus 3 is 7, plus 7 more is 14, plus 2 more is 16, plus 1 more is 17. So that's a nice convenient check. And I do recommend you do that because it's very easy when you have raw data to miss one of them when you're counting them up. All right, so these are the 2 things that are absolutely required to have a frequency table. So this is your basic frequency table. Sometimes that's all somebody needs. That's all they might report in terms of a frequency table. That is sufficient for being a frequency table. However, in many cases, people want to go a little bit extra. They want to show a little bit more of what's going on. So they will expand the frequency table to, like I said, include relative frequency and cumulative frequency. Sometimes one or the other, or sometimes both. So let's talk about what relative frequency is. I mentioned earlier that it's the fraction or the percent that's in each category. And we're talking about the fraction related to the entire number of grades. So for A's, we have 4 A's, and there are 17 grades altogether. So that would be the fraction of 4/17. Or converting that, we could get a percent by dividing 4 divided by 17. Remember how we divide with fractions is we start on the top, just like we say it, 4 over 17, 4 divided by 17. And then to make it into a percent, we multiply by 100. So 4 divided by 17 gives you a decimal, multiply by 100. And then generally with percents, we're going to round to the first decimal point. So you're going to go one value beyond the decimal point, and you will round that value generally. So when I round what I get from 4 divided by 17 in my calculator, I get 23.5. Our second relative frequency for the grade of B would be 3 over 17, which would be equal to, or approximately, because I do have to round, 17.6%. Now, it's not required that you show both the fraction and the percent when you're doing relative frequency. Generally, people do one or the other. In many cases, though, you'll find that people will tend to give the percent rather than the fraction. And I think that's because anymore people are a little uncomfortable with fractions, and they seem to be a little more comfortable with percents, even though fractions and percents really represent the same thing. They just represent them in different formats. So if we continue this, we would just take, we have 7 C's, we'd go 7 divided by 17. That's approximately 41.2%, and we could keep going. D's, 2 divided by 17 gives us approximately 11.8%. There's one F, 1 divided by 17 gives us approximately 5.9%. Once again, it's always nice to have a check. And the check here would be the total percent, because if you think about it, if we've included all of our data, our total percent for all of the data should be 100%, all of the data. So we add this up and we should get 100, or really darn close to 100, because we've rounded off. We may get 99.9% or we may get 100.1%, but we should be at 100 within a percentage point. So in this case, if you total them up, it comes out exactly to 100%, which is, again, a nice check. So the relative frequency gives us the percentage of the grades that are in that particular category. So as we could see, there were about 41% of the grades were C's, whereas about 24% were A's. Cumulative frequency is kind of a running total. And we start at the top with the first category. There are 4 A's. So when we start a cumulative frequency, we just start with how many that were in that single category we have so far. When we go to the next line down, we're going to create a total of what we currently have, which is 3, and what we had before, which is 4. So 3, our current value with B's, plus the number of A's we had would be 7. So again, what we're doing there is we're basically looking at, I'll kind of highlight it in red here. We're taking what we currently are plus what came before. So our current amount was 3, what came before is 4, so 3 plus 4 is 7. So cumulative is a running total. The next category is the C. We have 7 C's plus what came before, which was 7, means we have 14 grades altogether so far. The next category has 2. 2 plus 14 would be 16 grades. And last category of F has 1, so 16 plus 1 would be 7 grades. So it's a running total. And because it's a running total, by the time you get to the last category value, which will be for F, you should have all of the tests or all of the grades. These were papers, I suppose. So there is no need for a total in cumulative frequency. You would never total the cumulative frequency column because you actually have the total by the time you get to the last category. Now, you might say, well, why would anybody want Oops, I was trying to erase there. Why would anybody want a cumulative frequency? Well, cumulative frequencies sometimes are kind of useful because they tell you how many things you had up to that category. And with grades, that can be kind of interesting. For instance, this 7 cumulative frequency where we were at B's, this means that we have 7 papers that got a B or better. And that might be something you're interested in. Or for instance, if you're in high school and a D or better is passing, if we look at the D category, we had 16 papers that were a D or better. So 16 papers were passing. So sometimes the cumulative frequency has a nice meaning to the situation.